This is an early 19th century leather on softwood trunk. It's got tin corners and edging. It's got brass stud work to give it a little bit of extra protection. You've got iron carrying handles to the side. You've got very worn sledge feet underneath it. Bit of an inscription under there which is difficult to read. It looks like a series of numbers. Label, little brass plate, illegible label which has been partly covered, partly removed, and the owner's initial P. Well, this trunk, we can tell from these labels, belonged to Herbert Charles Perrott. And he is this gentleman. Now, Herbert was born in 1849. But this trunk was made by John Carman of 20 Marylebone Street, Golden Square, London. And it dates to before 1826, probably between 1818 and 1825. So there's a bit of a problem here because Herbert was born in 1849. Now there's a reason for all of this. We'll explain that a little bit further on. But let's look a little bit closer at John Carman and tell you about him and his dates, because he's a maker that we had heard of, but this is the only piece we've ever seen by him. So his label is on the inside of the trunk here. Let's come in a little bit closer and have a look. So we can see on the label it says bought J. Carman, canteen, military trunk and camp equipage manufacturer, 20 Marylebone Street, Golden Square. And of course, in this period, we know that a lot of the makers of campaign equipage were also trunk makers. People like J.W. Allen. They all basically started off as trunk makers and then added camp equipment to their wares. So that's not unusual. And the label looks fairly similar and standard to others of the period. There's not a lot of information on there. It's got the royal coat of arms with the symbols of war behind it, a sort of logo that a number of makers would have used. And John Carman, he was born in 1791, but he probably started his own business by around about 1818. He may well have been an apprentice to his father or to another trunk maker before then. We don't have that information yet. We know that by 1824 he had moved from 20 Marylebone Street to 67 Quadrant on Regent Street. Now, Regent Street and the Quadrant had been built by Nash, and the Quadrant specifically was intended to house high-class retailers. They didn't want grocers and butchers in there. They wanted fashionable people who would be very attractive to the hoi polloi of the area. And of course, Quadrant hadn't been built very long by this date. It was probably only about 5 or 10 years old. But after a couple of years, having moved up in the world from Marylebone Street to Quadrant, Carman moved again, and he went to 2 Bruton Street, just off Bond Street, and he stayed there for what was quite a long and so presumably successful career. He was still there in 1863, which was the year he died. So quite a long business really that went through most of the first half of the 19th century and into the second half of the 19th century. Now, let's just pull out a little bit, and you can see that we've got more information there on the owner, Herbert Chapman. And that handwritten inscription to the linen on the inside, the lining of this trunk, says Herbert Perrott, Esquire, Woolwich Arsenal Station, SER, Kent, England. Now, SER stands for Southern Eastern Railway Company. So that was put there to help his trunk find its way home. And I think we need to close up the trunk and have a look at some of the other labels, and they'll all start to make sense as we explain them to you. And we can also tell you how Herbert ended up having this trunk, even though he was born over 20 years after it was probably made. So we've got the P here formed out as studs for the name Perrott. And underneath here, we've got this applied engraved brass plate which says East Kent Militia. Now, Herbert Perrott was in the 3rd East Kent Militia, but before him, his father, Edward George Lambert Perrott, was also in the East Kent Militia. Edward was born in 1811, died 1886, became a captain in the East Kent Militia in 1839. So, with Edward being born in 1811 and this trunk made before 1824, when Carman moved to 67 and a quadrant, that still doesn't tie in, because Edward would have been 13 years old, far too young to go into the militia. But Edward's father, so Herbert's grandfather, was Edward Bindloss Perrott. He was born 1785, died 1859, and he was in the Royal West Middlesex Militia. So it's likely that the grandfather, Edward Bindloss Perrott, bought this trunk from Carman. He used it in his service in the militia. It got passed on to his son, Edward George Lambert, who also used it, and then eventually it went to Herbert Charles Perrott, who also used it in his service with the East Kent. And this label here, we can see it says Major H.C. Perrott, 3rd East Kent Regiment, Shorncliffe. Now that's Shorncliffe Camp, and this would have been a label for use on the railway, so that when it was sent down, because Perrott lived in Plumstead in South London, it would have been sent on the train, and then the label on the inside notes the return station, Woolwich Arsenal Station, Southern Eastern Railway. So we're beginning to see how this trunk has been used by 3 different generations of the Perrott family. And they certainly got their use out of it. I mean, it's a great trunk, but it is well worn. Let's move out and have another little look at it and talk you more through the trunk. So these 2 leather belt straps have been replaced. Originally the trunk would have had 2 belts following these tin lines wrapping over to secure it. These have been replaced at some time. Also, this fixed leather strap, which is probably intended to work like that, has also been replaced. Originally this would have been a strap which would have passed through the flap of the lock cover and then belted on this side. We can see on this side that this piece of the side flapping has been replaced. It's obviously a different lever, done some time ago, a running repair. We can see the flap, original flap is worn here on this corner, so not unexpected. We spoke about the sledge feet underneath. I mean, they certainly had some good wear to them. If we look at the back, we can see the original belt flaps, and you can see they're quite different to the ones at the front. You've got these two hinges here, partly exposed where some of the leather has worn, some cracking and wear to some of the leather on the back as well, with some of the softwood coming through. And if we come to this side, we can see that this part of the side flap has also been replaced up to here. There's been a neat cut made there where this section was worn and this was simply replaced. And it was quite important probably to put it back once it was worn, because the flap to the edge of the top helped make the trunk watertight. So any rain would run off the flap and down past the opening, and these raised boards would just create a nice strong seal just to keep all of your contents nice and waterproof. So yes, this trunk has had a life, but you know, it's been well used by 3 generations of soldiers through most of the 19th century. Now we think that Herbert probably would have inherited this from his father when Edward, when he died in 1886. Herbert became a major in 1889, and we see here that it says Major H.C. Perrott. Gives his regiment, and also says Camp Shorncliffe. So that label was put on specifically to be able to identify it when the trunk travelled down from Plumstead, where Herbert lived, down to the south coast to Shorncliffe Barracks. And then on the inside, we also saw that it gives the return address to the Woolwich Arsenal Station, Southern Eastern Railways, and that would have been the closest station, presumably, for Herbert to get back to his home at Plumstead. So all of that ties up really nicely. And of course, it's still a very usable trunk today. It's a great height to use as a coffee table, but it could go by the end of a bed to perhaps put your winter jumpers in or whatever. And just a great piece, a very unusual maker. We'd love to find more items by Carman. Possibly we have had some campaign furniture by him, but as most campaign furniture has lost its original packing cases, maybe we don't know. Maybe his labels, if we did have any pieces by him, were on the packing cases rather than the items, which is fairly typical. So let's sum it all up. It's a trunk which was made going on Carman's address before 1824, when he moved to 67 Quadrant. Leather on softwood, belonged to 3 generations of the Perrott family. Herbert, his father Edward, and his grandfather, also named Edward.